Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your source materials, filter out the noise, and extract the most surprising and essential nuggets of knowledge.
Today, we are undertaking, well, a monumental task, examining the life of a figure who is so often just confined to a single image on a coin.
Right, or a date on a constitutional amendment. Susan B. Anthony.
Exactly. And what we found in the sources, it fundamentally changes that perception.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to explore the entire radical arc of her career, which spans from 1820 right up to her death in 1906.
Because to just call her a suffragist, while it's accurate, it's also, profoundly incomplete.
Yeah, it completely misses the incredible force of personality she was, and the strategic genius she brought to so many different reform movements over, 6 decades?
It absolutely does. Our sources, they paint her not just as this pivotal women's rights activist, but as a tireless social reformer. She was so deeply committed to abolition, to temperance, and to labor rights.
She really spent decades driving social and legislative change in the U.S.
And maybe most importantly, she provided the organizational framework for modern, structured political activism. The kind of activism we still recognize today.
Let's start with a moment of high drama, a moment she actually orchestrated herself.
Okay.
We're flashing forward to Rochester, New York, 1872. It is November 18th, and Susan B. Anthony is arrested. And her crime.
The wicked crime of casting a ballot in the presidential election.
A direct, deliberate violation of the law at the time. She wasn't just, protesting randomly. This was a calculated legal challenge.
That arrest is the perfect entry point, I think, to understanding her uncompromising radicalism. We have sources that trace her entire path, from when she first started collecting anti-slavery petitions at just 17 years old.
17.
All the way to her death, which was a full 14 years before the 19th Amendment was finally ratified in 1920.
And that amendment is now colloquially known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment.
It is. She literally devoted her entire adult life to the cause and, never lived to see its ultimate success.
So why should you, the learner, invest this time in understanding the full breadth of her journey? Because I think she represents one of the most profound shifts in public perception in American history.
That's a great way to put it.
We're looking at a person who was, at first, harshly ridiculed, attacked in the press, accused of trying to, and I'm quoting, destroy the institution of marriage, all for advocating for women's independence.
And yet she persevered long enough to have her 80th birthday celebrated at the White House.
By the sitting president, William McKinley.
That transition right there, from public enemy number one to, a national icon, that is the heart of her legacy. It shows the power of relentless, sustained political pressure.
It really does. And it offers a kind of blueprint for how radical ideas, through organization and persistence, can become accepted national policy.
To really get the intensity of her conviction, you have to go back to the very bedrock of her upbringing.
Her Quaker roots.
Her Quaker roots in Adams, Massachusetts. And this wasn't just a casual religious background. It was a total immersion in social reform and a commitment to equality that just defined her family.
That idea of social equality, which is so fundamental to the Quaker faith, really was foundational for her.
It was. Her father, Daniel Anthony, was an abolitionist and a temperance advocate himself. But the family's radicalism was so strong, it actually led to a break with their own religious community.
Right. Daniel was formally disowned by his traditionalist Quaker congregation, and it was for 2 specific acts.
The first one makes sense. He married a non-Quaker, which was a clear religious breach.
But the second one is the one that's really surprising.
The second was allowing a dance school to operate in his home just to help make ends meet. Dancing was seen as a worldly, sinful activity by traditional Quakers.
So this act, as small as it sounds, was a final push for him.
It was a push toward a more liberal, less structured form of Quakerism. What we might call today an increasingly radical belief system, one that was focused on social justice over strict dogma.
That's a key point. Their reformist tendencies were strong enough to supersede even their core religious identity.
Then, in 1845, the family relocates to a farm on the outskirts of Rochester, New York. And that move was so pivotal for Susan's development.
Why there? What was it about Rochester?
Well, the Rochester farm essentially became a salon for the most progressive thinkers of the era. It was the Sunday afternoon gathering spot for local activists, transcendentalists, abolitionists.
And that's where she met Frederick Douglass.
It was. He lived nearby, and she developed a crucial and lifelong friendship with him there. Just imagine the constant high-level intellectual exposure she had. They weren't just discussing abolition, but the future of society, labor, everything.
And her father's vision for his children was incredibly progressive for the time, wasn't it? He really prepared them, including the girls, for economic independence.
He insisted on it. All his children had to be self-supporting, and he taught them business principles, making sure they understood accounting and management.
So that foundational belief that women should be financially independent, that was the spark for her first major realization about inequality.
It was, and that realization came pretty quickly, forced by circumstance. Her family suffered major financial ruin during the Panic of 1837.
Which basically forced her to start working to help support them.
Exactly. She taught for years, and eventually rose to become headmistress of the female department at Canajoharie Academy. She became a working woman by necessity.
Her first public speech, though, came pretty early. It was at a Daughters of Temperance meeting in 1849.
It was. But the real aha moment that propelled her fully into the women's rights fight wasn't about the ballot, not at first.
No.
She later admitted, I wasn't ready to vote, didn't want to vote, but I did want equal pay for equal work.
So it was a very practical, immediate focus rooted right in her professional experience. The distress over being paid so much less than men in similar teaching jobs, that daily injustice, that's what solidified her focus on economic rights first.
That's a key distinction that's often lost. For Anthony, political rights were a tool to achieve economic equality and legal autonomy. So by 1849, the academy closed, and she made a drastic commitment.
She left the family farm?
She left the farm to become, in her words, fully engaged in reform work. For the rest of her life, she lived almost entirely on the fees she earned as a speaker and organizer.
That level of professionalization is just astonishing for the time. She wasn't some activist hobbyist.
No.
This was her career. This was her income, which meant she had to be constantly effective and constantly on the move.
Precisely. And she embraced controversy immediately. She was so willing to experiment with public image.
You're talking about the bloomer dress.
The famous bloomer dress, she adopted it for a year, which was revolutionary, a short skirt worn over loose trousers. She found it far more sensible than the traditional heavy dresses that dragged on the ground.
But the sources say she stopped wearing it, even though it was more practical.
Yeah.
Why make that calculated retreat?
Well, it was a fascinating lesson for her in the strategic public image. She reluctantly stopped because her opponents and the press, they just seized on it.
Right. It was all they would talk about.
They mocked her constantly, focusing their ridicule entirely on her clothes rather than her political arguments. She realized the outfit was obscuring her message.
So she understood that sometimes, practicality has to yield to political necessity, just to make sure the core message is heard.
This brings us to the formation of, arguably the most enduring and consequential political partnership in American history.
1851.
In 1851, Anthony was introduced to Elizabeth Cady Stanton by Amelia Bloomer herself, the woman who lent her name to the dress.
And this was a genuine inflection point for the whole women's movement.
It was. Their skills were just perfectly complementary. They established this highly dynamic and effective division of labor, especially when you consider their very different personal circumstances.
Let's break down that famous division of labor. Stanton was the mind, right? The writer, the rhetorician, often stuck at home in Seneca Falls.
Correct. Stanton excelled at the intellectual stuff. The philosophy, the rhetoric, the heavy lifting of writing. She famously forged the thunderbolts.
And Anthony, meanwhile, she was the physical engine, the one who took those ideas and mobilized them.
She fired them. She excelled at organizing, speaking, managing, raising funds. And less glamorously, she stirred the puddings of everyday logistics.
And the logistical reality of that partnership required a deeply personal commitment from Anthony, right? Stanton was often homebound with 7 children.
The commitment was total. One biographer noted that Anthony was, quote, almost another mother to Mrs. Stanton's children.
Wow.
Anthony would literally move into the Stanton household for weeks or months at a time, supervising the children, running errands, just keeping the house quiet, while Stanton was upstairs writing the seminal speeches and articles that would define the movement.
Was that type of deep personal sacrifice, literally embedding yourself in a friend's family life, was that common for activists back then? Or does it just underscore the extraordinary lengths they had to go to?
I think it was extraordinary, and it really speaks to the necessary desperation of 19th century female activism. They had no institutional support, no central office, certainly no political staff.
They had to invent their own support structure.
They did, and Anthony's constant presence is what allowed those thunderbolts to be forged in the first place. It's what led the New York State movement to become the most sophisticated in the entire country by 1854.
Their early victories were focused on tangible legislative change, what we might call material feminism.
Right, specifically married women's property rights. This wasn't abstract political theory. This was about economic autonomy and family survival,
Because before these laws, a married woman was considered feme covert.
which legally meant she ceased to exist outside of her husband's identity. Any property she brought into the marriage, any wages she earned, it all belonged to him.
And Anthony understood that property rights were the key.
The key to unlocking freedom. So she organized this massive physical campaign to change it.
She did. She organized a lecture and petition campaign in almost every single county in New York in 1855.
And she was traveling relentlessly through difficult terrain, often in harsh weather. The sources talk about the sheer tenacity it required just to reach these remote areas in the horse and buggy days.
And all that hard, physical work culminated in the 1860 Married Women's Property Act.
It was a huge leap forward. It gave wives the right to own separate property, to enter into contracts, and, crucially, it gave them joint guardianship of their children.
A foundation of legal personhood.
It was, but we have to emphasize how precarious these victories were. During the Civil War, many of the protective elements of that 1860 Act were tragically rolled back in 1862.
Which must have been devastating.
And it demonstrated to Anthony that rights given by a legislature can be quickly taken away. That instability probably just reinforced her dedication to securing rights at the highest level, to the Constitution.
So, as that partnership with Stanton solidified, the early 1850s saw Anthony juggling these three major reform pillars all at the same time.
Temperance, teachers' rights, and anti-slavery.
And each battle gave her a pretty painful education in political organizing and public opposition.
Temperance, in particular, was the gateway issue for so many women because it was so acutely tied to their legal helplessness.
Right. Why was temperance considered a women's rights issue?
Because the law gave husbands complete control over everything: family finances, property, child custody. If a husband was an alcoholic, he could legally drink the family into destitution, abuse his wife.
And she would have virtually no legal power to leave him or protect her children.
Exactly. And Anthony's professional involvement started with this moment of just severe institutional sexism.
A textbook example.
She was elected as a delegate to a state temperance convention in 1852, only to be told by the chairman that women delegates were only there to listen and learn.
Oh, wow.
So Anthony and the other women, they immediately walked out, announced their own meeting, and formed the Women's State Temperance Society with Stanton as president.
And they demonstrated real political muscle right away.
They did. They collected 28,000 signatures for a prohibition petition, which was a massive number for the time. This resulted in the first formal hearing initiated by a group of women before the New York legislature.
But that initial success was, it was quickly derailed by internal conservative forces.
It was fragile. And it was fragile because it strayed from the narrow goal of prohibition. At the organization's convention the next year, conservative members attacked Stanton for her radical advocacy of divorce rights for the wives of alcoholics,
And Stanton was voted out.
which led both her and Anthony to resign in frustration. And that whole episode taught Anthony a crucial lesson:
Which was?
that any issue focusing on women's subservient status, whether to alcohol or to conservative men, would be met with swift and harsh opposition, even from within the reform movement itself.
The education system offered a similar, very public venue for confrontation. At the 1853 New York State Teachers Association meeting, her attempt to speak triggered this dramatic and lengthy debate.
The sources say the men debated for half an hour, just about the propriety of a woman speaking publicly at all. It was less about what she had to say and more about policing gender roles in a public space.
And when she was finally allowed to continue, she delivered that famous retort, challenging the entire professional structure of the male teachers.
Oh, she hit them right where it hurt their professional identity. She basically challenged the men by saying, if society believes women have plenty of ability to teach but are incompetent to be lawyers or doctors, then any man who chooses the teaching profession is tacitly admitting he has no more brains than a woman.
That is just pure intellectual strategy, taking their own logic and turning it right back against them.
She was absolutely uncompromising, and she used that platform to insist on tangible changes. Equal pay for female teachers, allowing women to serve as officers in the association, and pushing aggressively for coeducation at all levels, including colleges.
And her push for coeducation, which was incredibly radical, was dismissed by opponents as, a vast social evil.
a vast social evil, the first step in the school which seeks to abolish marriage. That's what they called it.
Wow. Beyond these professional battles, Anthony's anti-slavery work was concurrent and deeply personal. She was collecting petitions against the gag rule as a teenager.
And by 1856, she became the New York state agent for the American Anti-Slavery Society. Her personal commitment involved dangerous, direct action. We know from the sources she was directly connected to the Underground Railroad.
There's that diary entry.
In 1861, she noted in her diary fitting out a fugitive slave for Canada with the help of Harriet Tubman, who was a lifelong friend and fellow activist.
And the risk she took in her public anti-slavery advocacy was immense, especially as tensions escalated right before the Civil War.
It took tremendous moral courage. Mob action was a frequent occurrence. In early 1861, her meetings were shut down in nearly every town from Buffalo to Albany.
And the local authorities often refused to protect them.
That's right. She frequently required police escorts just for her personal safety.
You mentioned the violence in Syracuse. Can you paint a picture for us of what she was facing on the lecture circuit?
It was terrifying. Newspapers reported that in Syracuse, rotten eggs were thrown, benches broken, and knives and pistols gleamed in every direction. The opposition wasn't just disagreement, it was physical, organized violence designed to silence her.
Yet, she refused to stop.
She refused, and despite all this overwhelming opposition, she maintained a vision of a racially integrated society that was far more radical than the mainstream abolition movement's goals at the time.
Absolutely. Many abolitionists, including Lincoln at first, were focused just on ending slavery or sending formerly enslaved people to colonies outside the U.S.
But Anthony, in an 1861 speech, she articulated a full vision of racial integration. She demanded the opening of all schools, all shops, all business avocations to the colored man.
And she explicitly demanded the extension of all the rights of citizenship.
Yes. This was a full-throated demand for equality, anticipating the post-war amendments, but advocating for true social integration decades before it became a political reality.
So, the start of the Civil War. It forces Anthony and Stanton to make a strategic pivot.
They had to. They temporarily shelved the women's rights focus to concentrate entirely on abolition, which, in the end, actually solidified their organizational prowess.
With the Women's Loyal National League in 1863.
This was a brilliant tactical decision. They understood that the most immediate crisis was slavery. The League was organized to campaign for the 13th Amendment, and it became the first national women's political organization in the U.S.
And it leveraged all the skills they had learned in those smaller New York campaigns.
It did. And the sheer scale of the work they accomplished during that time, it really demonstrated the political potential of women as a national force, even without the vote.
It resulted in the largest petition drive in U.S. history up to that point.
Gathering nearly 400,000 signatures, which, for context, was about 1 in every 24 adults in the northern states. The political lesson was crystal clear. Women could mobilize on a massive scale.
It proved the power of a formal structure.
And it provided women with a practical, powerful vehicle for political action at a time when petitioning was their only legal tool.
But once the war ended, that unity between abolition and women's rights, which had been cemented in the American Equal Rights Association, or AERA, it crumbled pretty quickly.
It did. And this led directly to the critical political moment known as the male crisis. This is where political idealism collided brutally with legislative pragmatism.
The crisis was the proposed 14th Amendment.
Right, which aimed to guarantee citizenship rights. But, and this is the crucial part, for the first time, it would introduce the word male into the Constitution when defining voting rights.
Why was that one word so devastating for the women's movement?
Because up until that point, the Constitution had been silent on sex. Adding the word male would legally enshrine a gender barrier. It would make women's suffrage infinitely harder to achieve.
And Stanton saw it coming.
She sounded the alarm, warning that if that word male be inserted, it will take us a century at least to get it out. And she was precisely right. It took 52 more years.
Abolitionist leaders like Horace Greeley urged them to accept the 14th and 15th Amendments, arguing this was the Negro's hour and that women's rights could wait.
And Anthony's response was just legendary in its uncompromising radicalism. It really represents the breaking point between coalition politics and ideological purity.
What did she say?
She refused to prioritize black male suffrage over universal suffrage, declaring, "I would sooner cut off my right hand than ask for the ballot for the black man and not for women."
Wow.
For Anthony, having fought so hard for universal freedom, allowing the Constitution to explicitly establish an aristocracy of sex by enfranchising all men while excluding all women was just morally unacceptable.
To articulate this uncompromising position, they needed their own platform.
An independent platform.
Yeah.
So they launched the Revolution Weekly newspaper in 1868.
And its motto perfectly captured their spirit of defiance.
Men, their rights, and nothing more. Women, their rights, and nothing less. Anthony managed the business subscriptions, printing, distribution, while Stanton and Parker Pillsbury edited.
They really envisioned it as this vital political instrument.
They hoped it would become a daily paper owned and operated by women, countering the increasingly conservative reform periodicals of the time.
But running a radical paper with no institutional backing is a massive undertaking, and the funding evaporated almost immediately.
It did. Their initial and very controversial funder, George Francis Train, was jailed. So the financing collapsed.
And Anthony, as the business manager, took on all the debt.
All of it. Mounting debt that ultimately totaled around $10,000, a huge sum for the time, maybe $250,000 today. And she spent the next 6 years of her life in constant motion, lecturing relentlessly across the country to pay off every single dollar herself.
That just highlights her incredible personal sacrifice and commitment to financial independence, even when it meant carrying this disastrous financial burden.
It really does.
Before the final split in the movement, though, they made this critical attempt to form a massive coalition with the labor movement.
The National Labor Union, or NLU, they envisioned a triple power of producers. Working men, women, and Negroes, all uniting to wrest power from non-producers.
It sounds so powerful on paper. Why did that alliance also fail?
It failed because of a fundamental clash between gender and class loyalty. The breaking point was the printers' strike in 1869. Anthony, who was so focused on securing employment for women in skilled trades, a major goal of the revolution, she supported an employer-sponsored program to train women as printers.
Which was seen by the NLU as supporting strikebreakers.
Exactly. The male unionists viewed her actions as undermining solidarity, even though Anthony argued she was just giving working women access to profitable, skilled jobs that had previously been reserved only for men.
That political miscalculation cost her dearly.
She was quickly unseated as a delegate at the next NLU Congress, and that powerful labor alliance just collapsed.
Despite that failure, they did use their newfound platform to secure a victory in the labor sphere, right? With Hester Vaughan.
That win showed their political effectiveness in legal advocacy. They won a pardon for Hester Vaughan, a domestic worker convicted of infanticide, by arguing that the social and legal system treated working women unfairly and denied her fair representation.
But that one win aside, the political differences over the 15th Amendment proved too great.
It did. It led to the formal dissolution of the AERA in 1869 and the infamous split.
So let's clearly define that schism for the listener.
Yeah.
We ended up with the National Woman Suffrage Association, or NWSA,
Led by Anthony and Stanton.
and the American Woman Suffrage Association, or AWSA.
Led by Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe. The core difference, as we said, was the 15th Amendment.
The NWSA opposed it.
They opposed the 15th Amendment because it prohibited the denial of suffrage based on race but not on sex. Anthony articulated this as creating an oligarchy of sex, which makes the men of every household sovereigns, masters, the women subjects, slaves.
She saw the political elevation of all men as the constitutional subjugation of all women.
And their strategies were different, too. The NWSA focused its energy on a national constitutional amendment and maintained political independence. They refused to ally with any party that didn't support their goal.
And the AWSA.
They were more pragmatic. They supported the 15th Amendment. They preferred a state-by-state strategy to win local victories. And they initially maintained close ties with the Republican Party.
The hostility was intense, fueled by personal ambition, strategy, and ideology.
It was. Yet, 2 decades later, Anthony was the driving force behind healing that rift.
How did she, the person who stood for ideological purity, manage to bridge that gap?
At the end of the day, she was the ultimate pragmatist when it came to organizational structure. By the late 1880s, Anthony recognized that the hostility was just draining the movement's resources and effectiveness.
So she personally engineered the unification.
She did, in 1890, forming the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA. She focused less on past ideological arguments and more on future organizational strength, and she later served as NASA's president. She understood that victory required a single, united front.
After that bitter political split, Anthony and the NWSA adopted this radical new legal strategy to force the issue.
Yes, the attempt to vote and then challenge the laws under the 14th Amendment.
They asserted that voting was a privilege or immunity of citizens that the states couldn't abridge.
It was a brilliant piece of civil disobedience designed to force the courts to interpret the rights conferred by post-war citizenship. And the sequence of events in Rochester in 1872, it just shows Anthony's meticulous planning.
She and nearly 50 other women registered to vote.
Arguing they met the definition of citizens, on Election Day, she and 14 others successfully convinced hesitant inspectors to allow them to cast their ballots.
They succeeded in voting, but the legal system struck back almost immediately.
On November 18, 1872, a U.S. deputy marshal arrested Anthony. She was charged with illegally voting, but knowing that her ultimate goal wasn't acquittal but public education, she used the months before her trial to maximum effect.
She basically pre-campaigned to the jury pool.
Exactly. She toured Monroe and Ontario counties, where the potential jurors resided, asking this pointed question in her speeches. Is it a crime for a U.S. citizen to vote?
She was appealing directly to women everywhere to exercise their too long neglected citizens' right to vote.
She turned her criminal case into a national political rally.
The actual trial, United States v. Susan B. Anthony, which began in June 1873, is often called a judicial fiasco because of the presiding judge.
Oh, it was a profound miscarriage of justice.
Yeah.
Trial was presided over by Justice Ward Hunt, who had just been appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court but had virtually no experience as a trial judge.
And to make it worse, Hunt refused to allow Anthony to testify in her own defense.
Which, while technically legal under common law at the time for criminal defendants, meant she was completely unable to challenge the prosecution's narrative.
But the moment that really defines the trial is when Judge Hunt took the verdict out of the jury's hands entirely. Can you explain the legal gravity of that move, the directed verdict?
The gravity is enormous. In a criminal case, the jury is supposed to weigh the facts and determine guilt. After both sides presented their evidence, Hunt delivered this lengthy, pre-written opinion that he had drafted before the jury even began deliberation.
Wow.
And then he directed the jury to deliver a guilty verdict.
That sounds like a complete violation of due process.
It is. It essentially turned the courtroom into a stage for the government to impose a political judgment, removing the cornerstone of the Anglo-American legal tradition, the jury's right to determine guilt. And this high-handed action just amplified the feeling of political persecution among her supporters.
But that judicial fiasco led to one of the most famous speeches in the history of the women's rights movement.
When Anthony was asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she refused to stop talking. She delivered a masterpiece of defiance, repeatedly ignoring the judge's orders to sit down.
She protested what she called a high-handed outrage upon my citizens' rights.
She went even further. She dismantled the very system that had convicted her by pointing out the deep irony. She was denied a trial by a jury of her peers precisely because women were prohibited from serving on juries.
So she argued the entire process was fundamentally corrupt.
Exactly, because it was administered by men for men.
And when Justice Hunt sentenced her to a $100 fine, about $2,600 in today's money, her refusal was absolute.
I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty, she declared, and she kept that promise until her death. But here's the strategic brilliance of the judge.
Okay.
Hunt refused to order her taken into custody for non-payment.
Wait, why was that a strategic move by the judge? If she was jailed, she could have appealed the case, couldn't she?
Exactly. If she had been jailed for non-payment, she would have had a clear path to appeal her case, potentially all the way to the Supreme Court. By fining her and then refusing to enforce the sentence through incarceration, Hunt closed off her legal avenue for challenge.
Ensuring the verdicts stood without a review by the nation's highest court.
That's right. And the Supreme Court itself ended the judicial strategy 2 years later anyway. In 1875, they ruled in Minor v. Happersett that the Constitution of the United States does not confer the right of suffrage upon anyone.
Which ended any hope of winning the vote through the courts.
It did, and it confirmed that the only path forward was the one Anthony had already started, campaigning for a constitutional amendment.
With the courts closed off, Anthony's focus shifted again. The battle wasn't just political anymore, it was also historical.
Yes, she dedicated herself to chronicling the past and globalizing the struggle. She wanted to ensure her fight wasn't forgotten and to lay the groundwork for future generations.
So, starting around 1876, Anthony, Stanton, and Matilda Joslyn Gage began this mammoth task of compiling the history of women's suffrage.
And this wasn't just some fun side project. It was a desperate, self-funded attempt to preserve the movement's records before they were lost and, to establish the movement's authoritative narrative.
The sheer scale of this work is legendary. 6 volumes, over 5,700 pages, spanning 41 years of publication. And the sources say Anthony, the great organizer, she absolutely hated the sedentary nature of the work.
She physically despised being tied to a desk. She handled all the production details, the research, the correspondence, and she often wrote in her letters that the project makes me feel growly all the time.
Ah,
She famously stated, "No warhorse ever panted for the rush of battle more than I for outside work. I love to make history, but hate to write it."
that quote is perfect.
And we know the physical reality of the work was immense. She even had to limit the number of books she was storing in her sister's attic because the weight was literally threatening to collapse the structure.
That anecdote really brings home the physical reality of historical preservation back then. But we have to address the critical context here. While the history preserved all this irreplaceable material, it was inherently biased, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Because it was written by the leaders of the NWSA faction, Anthony and Stanton, the history necessarily overstates their roles and minimizes or entirely ignores rivals like Lucy Stone and the AWSA.
So for decades, this massive text was the primary source for historians.
Meaning it actively shaped the historical narrative and required later historians to work really hard to balance the record. It was as much a political document as a historical one.
So Anthony's strategy then moved outward. She started looking beyond U.S. borders with a 9-month tour of Europe in 1883.
Her focus was on creating a formalized international structure to connect women's movements globally, and this led directly to the founding of the International Council of Women, ICW, in Washington in 1888.
This was a hugely significant event. It brought together delegates from 53 organizations across 9 countries.
And what's crucial about the ICW is that it wasn't just a suffrage group.
No, it demonstrated this broad support for women's concerns. It included non-suffrage groups like professional groups, literary clubs, charitable organizations.
It was a coalition designed to show that women were organized and powerful across various spheres of public life, not just at the ballot box. And this movement gained serious, high-level political credibility almost immediately.
It opened doors. President Cleveland hosted a reception for the delegates at the White House.
And Queen Victoria hosted one for a later Congress in London. Anthony was being recognized as a major global political figure, moving seamlessly between different heads of state.
One of her most clever acts of political maneuvering involved the World's Congress of Representative Women at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. She ensured women were recognized without rousing conservative opposition. How does she pull that off?
She worked quietly and strategically behind the scenes. She knew that a public campaign by known suffragists would immediately draw opposition from conservative religious and political groups.
So she covertly initiated a petition.
Not from the radical suffragists, but signed by the wives and daughters of powerful figures, Supreme Court judges, senators, cabinet members.
Using the social status of these political elites as cover.
Precisely. This political maneuvering ensured the exposition officially recognized the role of women. The resulting event was huge, hosting delegates from 27 countries, and suffrage was discussed in almost all of the 81 sessions.
It proved that women's voices could not be silenced, even on the grandest stage.
And finally, we see her planning for the movement's long-term future through this global suffrage work, ensuring continuity. The capstone was the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, IWSA, founded in Berlin in 1904.
This was primarily by Carrie Chapman Catt, one of Anthony's protégés.
A pure suffrage organization designed for the final global push. Anthony was named the honorary president and first member, an honor which gave her profound satisfaction in her final years. She knew the cause would continue under dedicated, trained leaders.
That mentorship model was so key to her success. In 1891, at age 71, she finally settled into her sister Mary Stafford Anthony's home in Rochester after decades of living out of hotels and friends' houses. But she was still tireless.
Her physical energy was legendary, even into her 70s. Sources mention her traveling extensively, even touring Yosemite on the back of a mule at age 75. But she made sure the next generation, the younger activists known as her nieces, including Kat and Anna Howard Shaw, were fully prepared to take the reins.
Ensuring the movement's leadership didn't die with the founding generation.
And she demonstrated this remarkable practical commitment to education, showing she fought not just for the right to vote, but for the necessary tools for women to succeed.
She played a key role in raising funds for the University of Rochester to finally admit women students.
And when the campaign stalled, she personally pledged her life insurance policy to close the final funding gap. This act just shows her absolute dedication to ensuring women had access to higher education. She saw it as critical to empowerment as the ballot itself.
And the arc of public opinion finally caught up to her, culminating in that celebration at the White House for her 80th birthday, hosted by President William McKinley.
It is the ultimate contrast. The woman who was once mobbed in Syracuse and arrested for the crime of voting
Was now being celebrated by the political elite. She transitioned from a radical extremist to a venerated senior political figure within her own lifetime, which is a rare feat for any revolutionary.
Moving beyond her political biography, let's look at Anthony's personal philosophy, particularly her complex views on religion, which shaped her approach to work and her famously single status. She was raised a Quaker, but her path was far from traditional.
Her religious heritage was mixed by necessity. Her family moved from the traditional Quaker sect to a more liberal branch, and they eventually settled on attending the First Unitarian Church of Rochester.
And Elizabeth Cady Stanton later described Anthony as an agnostic. She did, though Anthony herself continued to identify with her Quaker roots. She valued the faith's commitment to internal moral guidance over external dogma. She seems to have had a very utilitarian approach to faith, almost equating work with worship.
Right.
She articulated her personal theology by saying, "Work and worship are one with me. I cannot imagine a God of the universe made happy by my getting down on my knees and calling him great."
Her focus was entirely on visible, demonstrable action and social improvement.
And this spiritual honesty meant she refused to adopt a facade of belief. She stated pointedly that she could not dash her faith with my doubts when she was comforting her dying sister.
Her views on marriage and her decision to remain single are particularly insightful. They're so deeply rooted in the legal and economic constraints women faced back then. Was this a conscious political choice, or is it simply a matter of preference?
I think it was overwhelmingly a conscious political choice, driven by necessity and legal status. We discussed the concept of feme covert earlier, the legal non-existence of a married woman.
So Anthony recognized that as a single woman, a feme soul, she maintained her legal rights. She could sign contracts, manage money, travel freely without a husband's permission.
Which was absolutely essential for running a national political movement. It was non-negotiable. Marrying meant surrendering the very autonomy required to be the organizational engine of the women's rights movement.
And her personal statements about singleness were defiantly strong.
She stated she never found a man necessary to my happiness. And to a journalist, she explained her rationale for avoiding marriage very clearly. She said had she married young, she would have been a drudge or a doll for 59 years. Think of it.
That quote just perfectly encapsulates the high stakes of marriage for 19th century women. It often meant the total cessation of a public professional life.
And she saw this as a systemic issue. In 1877, she predicted an epoch of single women if women would not accept marriage with subjugation. She was signaling that until the legal relationship between husband and wife was based on equality, marriage itself remained a political trap for ambitious women.
Finally, we really must address the modern dispute surrounding her views on abortion. It's a topic that has often been politicized using her name. What does the scholarly consensus, based on the full body of her papers, tell us?
Yeah, it is crucial here to rely on the findings of experts who work directly with the primary source material. I'm talking about the decades-long project that compiled and edited the Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony papers.
Okay.
Ann D. Golden and Lynn Scherer, lead researchers on that project, have stated very clearly that Anthony never voiced an opinion about the sanctity of fetal life or about using state power to require pregnancies to be carried to term.
So when modern groups cite her as an outspoken critic of abortion, what is the scholarly consensus on the sources they are using? Are they authentic?
The consensus among these primary source scholars is complex. They agree that the statements often cited are either misattributed entirely, taken drastically out of context, or, most commonly, refer to the desperate social circumstances that drove women to seek abortions in the 19th century.
So Anthony and her colleagues saw abortion as a tragic symptom of women's subjugation.
Exactly. Their lack of legal control over their bodies, their finances, their marriage contracts. She focused on removing the root causes, the lack of rights, rather than advocating for state prohibition of the act itself. Her goal was women's control and empowerment, not state interference.
Susan B. Anthony's final years were characterized by this unwavering certainty in the ultimate victory. She died on March 13, 1906, at age 86, from heart failure and pneumonia, still 14 years shy of the 19th Amendment's ratification.
Her final public words, which she delivered at her birthday celebration just days earlier, became the rallying cry that defined the movement's final push.
What did she say?
She acknowledged the vast network of women who had committed themselves, stating, "There have been others also just as true and devoted to the cause. I wish I could name everyone. But with such women consecrating their lives, failure is impossible."
She never saw the national victory, but she witnessed enormous progress in cultural acceptance. She expressed pride in the greater revolution than in the sphere of woman during this 50 years.
By the time of her death, women had achieved full suffrage in 4 Western states: Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. And more broadly, legal rights for married women had been established in most states, undoing that femme covert status she fought so hard against.
And there was a colossal shift in education.
36,000 women were attending colleges and universities, up from almost zero in the mid-1800s. She fought for the right to be a full person, not just the right to cast a ballot.
Her legacy was almost immediately solidified. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, was justly known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment.
And she became the first female citizen to be depicted on U.S. coinage with the 1979 dollar coin, cementing her role as a primary figure in American history.
What's truly moving, and I think often overlooked, is that the first physical memorial dedicated to Anthony was established by African-American women.
It is a profound historical testament. In 1907, Hester C. Jeffrey, the president of the Susan B. Anthony Club, an organization of African-American women in Rochester, installed a stained glass window in a local AME Zion church.
And Jeffrey noted that Anthony stood by the Negroes when it meant almost death to be a friend of the colored people.
This memorial, it just underscores the cross-racial coalition she prioritized and maintained, despite the painful political schism over the 15th Amendment.
And finally, that defiant spirit from the 1873 trial, that refusal to submit to an unjust system, it resurfaced recently during the 2020 posthumous pardon controversy.
It did. When a posthumous presidential pardon was announced, the president of the National Susan B. Anthony Museum and House declined the offer. They argued that accepting the pardon would wrongly validate the unjust 1873 trial.
A very outcome Anthony fought against.
So her original refusal to pay the fine remains this powerful, active symbol of moral victory over a corrupt legal process.
The incredible complexity of her life, the tireless organizer, the massive debtor, the friend of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, the agitator who battled mobs, and the strategist who invented modern lobbying, it's overwhelming. Her life was defined by the intensity of the struggle.
And she clearly foresaw the danger of future generations taking her hard-won liberties for granted.
She did. In 1894, she voiced this very fear. She said, "We shall someday be heated, and when we shall have our amendment, everybody will think it was always so. They have no idea of how every single inch of ground that she stands upon today has been gained by the hard work of some little handful of women of the past."
That brings us to our closing thought for you. When we look at the immense battles she fought, from establishing equal pay and coeducation to securing basic property rights, what area of social justice today might we similarly be taking for granted, assuming they were always so?
What forgotten battles from the past are shaping the very institutions and liberties we rely on now?
You should think about Anthony's most crucial tools. Persistence, the creation of clear organizational structure, and the power of radical, uncompromising friendship. Her blueprint for sustained, decades-long activism is still so relevant. We have to ask ourselves, what fundamental rights are being fought for right now that future generations will simply assume were always there?
Consider the current value of the incomparable organizer's approach. We hope this deep dive into the historical sources has provided you with a new appreciation for the long game of social change.